There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a man who has just survived something he cannot explain. Not the silence of relief, not the silence of exhaustion, something older than both of those. The silence of a mind attempting to reconcile what it was trained to expect with what it actually encountered on the ground, in the mud, in the half-light of a collapsing defensive line somewhere in France or North Africa or the Italian hills. British soldiers in the Second World War were not naive men. They were not sent into battle uninformed or unprepared, at least not in the conventional sense. They had drilled, they had studied, they had been told, through official channels and regimental tradition alike, what the enemy looked like and how the enemy fought. And then they met him, and the reports they filed afterward, the diaries they kept, the memoirs they would eventually write, the interrogation debriefs and the after-action assessments that now sit in archives from Kew to Edinburgh, those documents tell a story that is considerably more complicated than the one that tends to appear in popular accounts of the war. This is not a story about German invincibility. They were not invincible. History confirmed that conclusively enough. This is a story about what excellence in war actually looks like when you are standing on the receiving end of it, and what the men who survived that experience said when they were finally asked to describe it honestly. The first thing that strikes a reader moving through the British regimental archives of the early war period is how quickly the initial assumptions collapsed. In 1939 and into 1940, there existed within certain quarters of the British officer class a residual confidence, not arrogance exactly, but a kind of institutional certainty that the Wehrmacht, whatever its political masters might represent, was an army whose capabilities fell within understood parameters. The Great War had produced a generation of British commanders who believed, not unreasonably, that they possessed a mature and tested framework for understanding modern industrial warfare. They had survived the Somme. They had survived Passchendaele. They understood, in their bones and in their doctrine, what a mass military engagement demanded. What they did not fully anticipate was the degree to which the German military establishment had spent the intervening 20 years in a state of radical institutional self-examination, dissecting every failure, reconsidering every assumption, and producing, by 1940, a combined arms doctrine of extraordinary sophistication that had very little in common with what the British High Command was prepared to face. The encounter came swiftly, and the testimony it generated was immediate. Corporal Albert Thorn of the 2nd Battalion, Durham Light Infantry, found himself retreating through Belgium in May of 1940 as the German armored breakthrough at Sedan unraveled the Allied defensive plan with a speed that few on the British side had believed geometrically possible. He wrote in his diary, a document later preserved by the Imperial War Museum, that the German infantry following behind the armor moved with a quality of purpose he had never encountered in any training exercise. They did not advance in the dense waves that British doctrine had prepared him to expect, and that British machine gun positions had been calibrated to repel. They moved in small, dispersed groups, using ground instinctively, communicating laterally in ways that suggested not a rigid command structure issuing orders from above, but something more organic, more adaptive, more immediately responsive to the terrain and the moment. Thorne wrote that watching them work was, and this is his precise phrasing, like watching men who had been born to this specific task. That phrase, born to this specific task, recurs in various forms across a remarkable number of British accounts from this period. It points toward something that was not, in fact, biological or innate, but was instead the product of a training culture so demanding, so psychologically immersive, so focused on the development of individual initiative at the lowest tactical level, that by the time German soldiers reached the battlefield, they had already internalized the decision-making frameworks that their British counterparts were often still waiting to receive from superiors 3 levels above them in a command chain that had not been designed for the tempo of mechanized war. The concept that German military theorists called Auftragstaktik, a term that translates loosely as mission tactics, but whose implications stretch considerably further than that translation conveys, was not a new idea in 1940. It had roots in the Prussian military reforms of the 19th century, in the writings of Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, in a tradition that understood war as fundamentally unpredictable, and that therefore placed supreme value on the capacity of subordinate commanders to act decisively and independently within the framework of a commander's broader intent, even when, especially when, communication with higher command had broken down entirely. What the Wehrmacht had done between the wars was take this tradition, stress-test it against the actual lessons of 1914 to 1918, and embed it so deeply into training at every level that it functioned not as a doctrine to be consciously recalled, but as a reflex. British officers who captured German soldiers and participated in their interrogation during the early campaigns consistently noted a quality that unsettled them. Not hostility, not fanaticism, at least not in the crude form that propaganda suggested. What they noted was competence. A bone-deep, unhesitating, almost casual competence that manifested in the way German prisoners answered tactical questions. Not with evasion, but with a kind of matter-of-fact precision that suggested they had thought about these problems more thoroughly and at a younger age than their British equivalents had been encouraged to do. Major Peter Barclay, then serving with the 3rd Battalion Grenadier Guards, wrote in a letter to his commanding officer, after a series of engagements in the Western Desert in 1941, that the German non-commissioned officer they were encountering was a fundamentally different creature from his British counterpart. Not in courage, Barclay was explicit about this, but in initiative. A German NCO, he observed, appeared to be trained to regard the moment of his officer's death or incapacitation not as a crisis that suspended operations, but as the moment at which his own command responsibilities simply expanded to fill the vacuum. British sections, he wrote with some discomfort, did not consistently behave this way. The training did not consistently produce this result. And on a fluid battlefield, where the tempo of events consistently outran the capacity of formal command structures to respond, this difference in what one might call the lower-order tactical self-sufficiency of the individual soldier had consequences that were both immediate and severe. If you have found this kind of history valuable, the kind that moves beyond the summary and into the texture of what soldiers actually experienced and recorded, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. The research that goes into work like this takes considerable time, and your support is what makes it possible to keep producing it at this level of depth. But the testimony of British soldiers about the German military does not exist in a single register. It is not uniformly of the odd and unsettled kind that the early campaigns generated. It is more complicated than that, and considerably more interesting, because it evolves across the war in ways that track very precisely the evolving reality of what the Wehrmacht actually was at different stages of the conflict. In North Africa, the encounter with Rommel's Afrika Korps produced a body of testimony that remains, 7 decades later, among the most psychologically revealing documentation in the British military archive. Rommel himself became, almost immediately, and almost against British official preference, a figure of considerable narrative power within the British Army. Churchill was eventually compelled to stand in the House of Commons and warn his colleagues against creating a legend around an enemy commander, which was itself a remarkable admission of the degree to which that legend had already taken root among the men fighting him. The legend did not emerge from nowhere, it emerged from contact. Lieutenant John Harding, who would later rise to Field Marshal, recalled that the first thing you understood when you encountered the Afrika Korps in action was the extraordinary quality of their combined arms coordination. British armor and British infantry and British artillery, in the early desert campaigns, did not consistently support one another in the fluid, mutually reinforcing way that German combined arms formations did almost automatically. British tanks attacked without adequate infantry support. British infantry advanced without adequate armored support. The coordination that should have existed at every level of the tactical structure often had to be negotiated in real time between unit commanders who had not trained together, who did not share a common doctrinal language, and who were attempting to cooperate under fire in conditions that their pre-war preparation had not adequately anticipated. The Germans did not have this problem, not because they were without friction — every military force operates under friction — but because their doctrine had anticipated the problem and their training had produced formations that were organically capable of combined operations at a level that British forces would not consistently achieve until considerably later in the war. Private Ronald Dodd of the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, was captured in June of 1942 following the fall of Tobruk and spent several months in German captivity before escaping during a prisoner transfer. The account he gave upon his return to British lines, which was transcribed and entered into divisional records, contains a passage that has been quoted by military historians precisely because of its unguarded directness. Dodd described watching from captivity as German armored formations moved and communicated and responded to situations, and wrote that what distinguished them from his own experience of British armored operations was not speed alone, though they were faster, but the quality of what he called their situational instinct. The individual tank commanders, the individual vehicle crews, appeared to possess an immediate and shared understanding of what the situation required, that did not need to be transmitted through formal channels because it had been installed, through training and through operational experience, and through a culture of mutual professional expectation, into the behavior of every man in the formation. There is a temptation, reading these accounts, to construct from them a narrative of German military supremacy that the historical record does not fully sustain. The Wehrmacht had profound institutional weaknesses. Its logistics were chronically overstretched. Its strategic leadership became, as the war progressed, increasingly compromised by the interference of a supreme command that was ideologically committed to positions that professional military judgment could not support. Its treatment of occupied populations and prisoners of certain categories was not merely a moral catastrophe, but a strategic one, generating resistance and partisan activity on a scale that consumed resources and manpower the German military could not afford to lose. And at the purely tactical level, the level at which British testimony is most consistently impressed, the excellence that British soldiers encountered was neither universal nor inexhaustible. It was the product of a particular generation of soldiers, trained in a particular way, operating at the peak of a particular institutional moment. As the war progressed and attrition consumed that generation, the quality declined. By 1944, the Wehrmacht that British forces encountered in Normandy was not the same force that had broken through the Ardennes in 1940, and the testimony of soldiers who fought in both campaigns reflects that distinction clearly. But this is precisely what makes the early testimony so important to understand. Because what British soldiers described encountering in 1940, in 1941, and in 1942 was not the product of racial ideology or national character or any of the crude frameworks that wartime propaganda on both sides was invested in promoting. What they described was the product of institutional decisions, of training philosophy, of doctrinal choices that had been made in the years between the wars by men who took seriously the question of what modern warfare actually demanded of the individual soldier, and who built, in response to that question, a training system and a command culture that was specifically designed to produce soldiers capable of functioning at a high level of tactical competence and independent judgment even under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. That this system was in service of a regime whose fundamental character was criminal does not diminish the military analysis. It complicates it, necessarily and appropriately, but it does not diminish it. The campaign in Italy, which began in 1943 and continued with grinding attrition through 1944 and into 1945, produced yet another register of British testimony, one that is distinguished less by awe and more by a kind of exhausted professional respect for an enemy who had learned, in the absence of the offensive capacity that had defined his earlier success, to conduct defensive operations with a skill and economy that consistently frustrated Allied advantages in manpower and material. The German defensive performance in Italy was, by most serious military assessments, exceptional. The terrain was everything a defending force could wish for, and everything an attacking force could dread. A series of mountain ridges running perpendicular to the Allied axis of advance, each one a natural defensive position that the German command under Kesselring used with extraordinary tactical intelligence. The Winter Line, the Gustav Line, the Gothic Line, each of these defensive positions was not merely a physical obstacle, but a demonstration of the capacity of German military engineering and tactical thinking to extract maximum defensive value from geography. British officers who wrote about the Italian campaign, and many of them did, in the memoirs and regimental histories that appeared in the years after the war, returned repeatedly to a specific quality of the German defensive soldier that had not featured as prominently in the earlier accounts of the mobile war. Patience. An almost inhuman quality of patience, combined with fire discipline and the willingness to absorb artillery bombardment in positions of extraordinary discomfort. And then, when the moment came, to fight with a controlled ferocity that consistently surprised British soldiers, who had assumed that the preliminary bombardment had done its work. Captain Charles Mercer of the 6th Battalion Black Watch wrote in his memoir, published in 1957, that attacking a German defensive position that had been properly prepared was an experience that no amount of training could fully prepare a man for. Not because of the volume of fire, British soldiers were familiar with volume of fire, but because of its precision and its economy. The Germans, he wrote, did not fire in panic. They did not expend ammunition at targets that were not worth engaging. They conserved, they selected, and they waited, always, for the moment at which the expenditure of fire would produce the maximum disruption to the attacking force's momentum and cohesion. Mercer described this as a quality of collective professional discipline that he had spent the entire Italian campaign trying to install in his own company and had never, by his own honest assessment, achieved to the same degree. By the time of the Normandy campaign in the summer of 1944, British soldiers were encountering something that was both continuous with what had come before and significantly different from it. The German forces in Normandy included formations of varying quality. The regular Wehrmacht infantry divisions that held the western flank were, in many cases, composed of older soldiers or men recovered from wounds, units that had been rebuilt after catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, and that did not represent the peak institutional capacity of the German army. But they also included the Waffen-SS panzer divisions and the paratroop formations that did represent something closer to that peak, or at least to what remained of it after 5 years of war on multiple fronts. And it was these formations that generated the most intense and the most psychologically revealing testimony from British soldiers. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, is a particularly complex case, and its encounter with British and Canadian forces in the Bocage country southeast of Caen in June and July of 1944 generated testimony that sits at the intersection of military assessment and moral horror in ways that are difficult to disentangle. The division had been formed from the Hitler Youth Movement and was composed almost entirely of teenagers, soldiers who were, in some cases, 17 years old when they first encountered Allied forces. British officers who engaged them consistently noted two things simultaneously, and the coexistence of these two observations in the same accounts is itself historically significant. The first was their tactical effectiveness. The Hitlerjugend fought with a ferocity and a resilience that repeatedly shocked Allied commanders who had expected, after the weight of the preliminary bombardment and the weight of Allied material superiority in Normandy, that resistance of this kind was no longer possible. The second was the atrocity. Members of the division committed war crimes against Canadian prisoners in the first days of the campaign, shooting prisoners after capture in clear violation of the laws of war, and these crimes were documented and prosecuted after the conflict. British soldiers who encountered the Hitlerjugend in subsequent engagements knew about these killings. The testimony they produced is marked, distinctively and revealingly, by the particular emotional register of men who are professionally assessing an enemy they are simultaneously morally enraged by. A register that produces some of the most honest and most unsettling writing in the entire British archive of the Second World War. Sergeant William Coulter of the 1st Battalion Dorsetshire Regiment wrote in a letter home that he had fought against the Hitlerjugend for 3 days in the Odon Valley, and that they were the most formidable infantry he had encountered in the entire war, more consistently dangerous in close country than anything he had met in North Africa or Italy, and that this assessment sat in his mind alongside the knowledge of what they had done to Canadian prisoners, in a way that he could not reconcile and did not expect to reconcile. Professionalism and atrocity, he wrote, occupying the same body, the same uniform. It was, he concluded, the most disturbing thing he had seen in 6 years of soldiering. Not the violence, he was accustomed to violence, but the combination. What the accumulated testimony of British soldiers across 6 years of engagement with the German military reveals, when it is read in its full complexity and across the full arc of the war, is something that resists easy summary and resists the kind of conclusions that both wartime propaganda and post-war mythology were invested in producing. It reveals, first, that the tactical excellence of the German military, where it genuinely existed, and in its best formations it genuinely did exist, was an institutional achievement, not an inherent one. It was the product of a training culture and a command philosophy that had made specific and consequential choices about how to develop the individual soldier, about where in the command hierarchy to place the authority for tactical decision-making, and about what qualities, initiative, adaptability, lateral communication, individual judgment under stress, were worth cultivating systematically and at enormous institutional cost. It reveals, second, that British soldiers were, on the whole, acute and honest observers of these qualities. They did not minimize what they encountered. They did not reach for comforting fictions when the reality they had lived through was more complicated than the fictions required. The diaries and the letters and the memoirs and the after-action reports are, as a body of documentation, remarkably candid, marked throughout by the particular intellectual honesty of men who had no investment in the narrative other than the desire to describe accurately what they had seen and experienced before memory dimmed and the gap between experience and description widened irretrievably. It reveals, third, that the encounter with German military excellence was not a static experience across the war. It evolved as the war evolved. The formations that British soldiers described with something approaching awe in 1940 and 1941 were not identical to the formations they described with exhausted professional respect in Italy in 1944, or with the complicated mixture of military assessment and moral condemnation that characterized accounts of the Waffen-SS in Normandy. The German military was not a monolith. It was an institution undergoing continuous change under the pressures of a war that its political masters had made strategically unwinnable, and the testimony of British soldiers tracks those changes with a fidelity that is one of the most remarkable features of the archive. And it reveals, finally, something about the nature of warfare itself, something that the soldiers who recorded these observations understood in their bones even when they lacked the theoretical language to articulate it. That excellence in war is not a function of cause or ideology or the justice of the political system that has produced the army in question. It is a function of training, of doctrine, of the institutional choices that determine how a military force develops its people and structures its authority and prepares its soldiers for the particular demands of combat under conditions of extreme and sustained uncertainty. The German military, in its best formations and at the height of its institutional capacity, had made those choices with extraordinary deliberateness and considerable success. British soldiers encountered the results. And what they said about what they encountered, honestly, in the dark, in letters and diaries that were not written for publication or for posterity, but simply because soldiers in extreme situations reach for language when language is the only instrument of comprehension they have left. What they said was more truthful and more nuanced and ultimately more historically valuable than almost anything that was said about the war while the war was being fought. The silence that fell over a man who had survived something he could not explain. The diaries eventually broke that silence. And what they said deserves to be heard. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, history told through the voices of the people who lived it, without simplification and without sentimentality, then subscribing to this channel is the best way to ensure that more of it finds its way to you. Every subscription, every like, every comment that tells us what you found valuable in this kind of work, all of it makes the next one possible. There is more to tell. There always is.